I was hired by Jerry Jameson, who was the director of the picture. He had seen footage and films that I had done with Ivan Tors, such as Thunderball, Flipper, and other shows. And he liked the work. He recommended Bob Stedman as a cameraman. And Bob Stedman was the cameraman on MASH at the time. And I had lunch with Bob on the MASH set and talked about shooting the Titanic underwater and doing all the model work. And he flipped over it and he said, "I want to do it." And I said, "Well, do I need to give you a hard sell or something?" He said, "Nope." He said, "I want to do it." The thing that attracted me to this project was mainly that I love underwater and I've done a lot of underwater work.
Rico was somebody who always knew exactly what he wanted to do. He was not just somebody who took the work seriously, he took it personally.
I realized this was a very important picture. Sir Lou Grade, who financed the picture, at that time, I think it was the highest budgeted picture being made. Our budget was pretty high for the stuff I was doing. We shot for 5 months and spent, I think, about 500 hours underwater.
Raise the Titanic in 1979, 1980 was maybe the biggest thing in Hollywood at the time. I say Hollywood because it was a kind of a, I'm going to call it, it was a British production, but it was an Anglo-American crew. It was a large enterprise, and everybody wanted to work on it.
Directing the model sequences in Malta, it was a first for me, and it was a first for Bob, and a first for John Richardson, shooting underwater with models.
I actually took over the film after all the models had been made in California and shipped over to Malta. I went out to Malta quite delighted to be offered a picture of that size, particularly with the challenge of all the underwater work.
Between Rico Browning, Bob Stedman, and John Richardson, they had probably the best in the business when it came to doing what we were doing, which was filming underwater in Malta with models on this big show. The models were 4, 5, 6 feet. They were big. There were some that were even larger, and they had been tested to a fairly well. They worked great. And everything was tested in Hollywood, here in the US, and then shipped over, and we put them in the water, start to work, and they go. No one had thought to test them in salt water, which is all we were working in. So that was another aspect that we had to deal with right then and there.
Bob Wilcox had designed the submarines to run with controls underwater, and we were using fresh water. What we didn't realize is when we got to Malta and we shot underwater with the submarines, that the submarines worked totally different in salt water. And they had to put a tail on the submarine that ran about 3 or 4 feet behind the sub so that it would function correctly like it would in freshwater.
You're shooting 36 feet underwater in salt water, which posed horrendous problems for the models, keeping them dry inside. If you got water into the model, being salt water, it would start to corrode and it would foul up the electrics in about 3 seconds. We had the same problem with the cameras. We got a water leak in the camera housing and the camera would go down. So you'd go down to shoot and you consider yourself lucky if it wasn't the camera breaking down or the model breaking down or something.
Cameras are meant to shoot and to be one of the most trustworthy items on the set, and they are basically. But when you bring them underwater, you're tempting the fates. I mean, you start from Hollywood, just to get them to Malta is a big deal. I mean, we had over 100 cases. We had equipment of all kinds, and we have lenses, we have different camera bodies. We have cameras that go high speed. We just had a lot of things that had to be handled. It's a big undertaking, technically, for water and for anything around water. It just builds the requirements for maintenance, cleaning, and keeping things functioning. It requires a lot of extra work that you don't have when you're just shooting dry.
We talked to Matt Leonetti, the cameraman, and got a sort of lot of background knowledge of what we had to match to when we filmed the models in Malta.
I think the most difficult part of this film was to keep the look consistent with so many different locations. We started off on an island in Alaska. We went to San Diego. We went to Washington, D.C. We went to Hong Kong to scout. We actually ended up shooting in England. We shot in Los Angeles.
Filming the models and miniatures underwater is obviously a huge challenge. We were working in seawater, 36 feet down. We had a model Titanic that was 55 feet long and weighed 10 tons. So it took a lot of managing and manoeuvring.
When we were shooting Raising of the Titanic, Matthew Leonetti and his father came. They brought the cameras over, but Bob Stedman actually did the filming with the cameras.
We chose to shoot anamorphic of Raise the Titanic because we wanted that big screen look. So when people came to the movie, that movie would be intense in their eyes and just makes it look much more dramatic and much more dynamic. Anamorphic is a lens that's designed to be widescreen. It's 2.4 to 1 ratio. It's designed to have a very widescreen look, but what anamorphic does is compress the foreground to the background, so it brings the audience a little bit more into the movie. The challenging part of an anamorphic show is to fill the frame. That's the most difficult part of it. You have to design your close-ups, especially, with either a little bit longer lens so you don't have quite such a wide feel to it.
Cinematography is tricky just when you're dry, but when you go underwater, I have an expression, cameras were never meant to go underwater. So when you do that, you're taking on an added technological challenge. If you take a regular camera, you have to build a housing around it that will be watertight, and then you have to be able to use everything inside it from the outside. So that creates lots of little alleys and angles and places for things to go wrong.
In shooting models, both topside and underwater, in order to make them look like they're real and big, you have to overcrank. So everything we shot, we overcranked at least 1,000 frames a second. But when we shot the Raising of the Titanic, Matthew Leonetti brought cameras from the studio, and they shot, I think, 3,000 frames a second. So when we did the Raising of the Titanic, we used that camera from a high angle and shot the Titanic coming up. And we raised the Titanic at least 5 times. And John Richardson said at the time, "I'm glad you didn't go 6 because I broke the thing that was lifting it." And I think the Raising of the Titanic was one of the best parts of the picture. All of the footage underwater was shot overcranked, and all of the models underwater were overcranked. When I was saying we overcrank, and the camera shoots 3,000 frames a second, you usually shoot about 32 frames a second. And so you can imagine that really goes into slow motion.
The Titanic model itself was a great challenge to make it look real because, again, of its size. We had to get the camera lens in very close to it to give it the scale that it really needed and to make it look as big as it needed to look. So you have to get down underneath it, you have to get in really tight. Depth of field is very important, wide angle lenses, getting the right light on it.
Lighting underwater is different from lighting anywhere else. When you work in a tank like the Malta tank, you've got 9 million gallons of water that's brought in from the ocean directly. So that brings with it what we call particulate matter. You'll see that when you light normally or traditionally. So you have to find a way to cross-light. You find an angle that doesn't bring up those odd pieces of this and that, flotsam and jetsam, that come with being in a large water space. And I remember lining up 10 lights, 5 feet apart, 5Ks, underwater, and moving them apart and them in and out until we found the look that was right. And those lights covered the bow to the stern of the 55-foot model. And that took us weeks to figure out exactly what we liked. Once we got it, it's how it stayed. This was called the Mediterranean Film Facility when we were there. And, you know, it's built right on the water. It's built so that you can't see that it's right on the water. It's called a horizon view, and that's so that you can photograph right at water level, looking at the ship in which it looks like it's an open sea. And that is key. There is no facility in the world that is like the Malta tank. Titanic kind of set the bar. You couldn't have made the film the way we did it. You couldn't have done it without that tank.
We'd have like 15 or 20 men underwater at any one time in the tank. Sometimes we'd be shooting and we'd run out of air, but we'd have other people bring air tanks down to us, and we just switch tanks until we got too cold, and we'd come back up.
We showed up on the job with wetsuits, not appropriate for that water temperature. It took the company about a month to recognize our need for dry suits.
It was a very hard, grueling shoot. When it was really cold, we used to go down sometimes with a dry suit on with 3 or 4 layers of thermal underwear underneath, and sometimes a thin wetsuit as well, and then the dry suit on top, and you'd still lie on the bottom shivering.
It's key and important for divers to work at 30 feet because you go below that, you start getting into issues of recompression, and it just gets dicey. So working at 40 or 50 feet would not be a good idea because then you have to consider other mechanical aspects having to do with the body. But 30 feet, which is where we spent all our time, worked perfectly.
We were following US Navy dive tables. If we were doing it today, we wouldn't be allowed to do anything like that amount of time underwater and the amount of going up and down that we did, which is now recognised as being much more limiting than it was then. We could be in there for 6 or 8 hours a day. We could be submerged for 3 hours at a time. We often used to take down several tanks and change tanks underwater on the bottom to save coming up. The ear pain as you tried to surface after being down there for a long time was excruciating, so you'd have to come up really, really slowly.
The most difficult thing of the filming, as far as special effects was concerned, was the stuff that John Richardson had to do, raising the Titanic. He had worked it out so well that the first time we shot it coming up, it worked perfectly. We didn't have to readjust it, refix it, or whatever. So we just kept doing it over and over again.
There was a major problem solver there, so the problems that effects had were eliminated in a large degree by the prowess, expertise, and personality of John Richardson. Well, John made it really easy because his stuff worked. The explosions underwater, that was not easy to create underwater. But once it was done, it worked pretty well. And then, of course, you see it underwater, and it's very effective.
My favourite scene in the film is definitely the raising, because that's obviously the most difficult thing that we had to do on the film. We had to raise a 55 feet long ship from water that was only 36 foot deep. It had been planned back in the early design stages that after we'd done all the underwater shooting up to the raising, then we'd drain the tank down and dig the tank even deeper to set the model back down so it could start off underwater and then push it up on a ramp. I didn't think that was a particularly good idea, and I know everybody else was worried about time schedules and everything else, so I designed a method of bringing it up where we mounted the ship on a crane arm which would pivot the ship up so we could actually start it flat on the bottom, hold it down there with two 9-ton braking strain steel cables, and then release the ship because we'd pull it down there, we'd blow all the buoyancy tanks to give it maximum lift, and then we'd release the cables that were holding it down in a specific order. So we released the front one, which would allow the front of the ship to come up first, bringing it up at an angle, getting the bows through the surface, and then we'd release the tail cable. And it actually gave it a very realistic movement when it broke through the surface and settled back down on the water.
Our view of the model itself was a combination of a kind of a kid's reaction to an extraordinary Christmas toy and the fact that we were going to be able to work with it. I mean, when you see it coming out of the water, it's, you buy it.
The model of the Titanic that we had for the film was 55 feet long and weighed over 10 tons. We had to take the model completely apart and rebuild it with buoyancy tanks inside that we worked out would be sufficient to hold the weight, but at the same time would give us controllability of the model when it was floating, controllability of the model when it was underwater, and controllability of the model when it was being raised. Because of the size of the real ship, which was 900 feet long, our model was limited to 16th scale, which is, when you're shooting models, a very small scale to be able to make look real with the water scale that you're having to use. In an ideal world, when you're working with water, you don't want to get much smaller than about 3rd scale. Moving down to 16th scale, it was very difficult to make the water droplets match and the water size look correct.
After the Titanic was raised in the movie, we had to find a ship that could double as the Titanic. We ended up going to ship graveyards in Hong Kong, in Greece, and in England. And we finally found one in Greece where we shot the movie after the Titanic was raised, the interior. They dressed the salon and the outside of the ship to make it look like a ship that had been underwater for how many years. You used some glass paintings, which were pretty incredible. These fellows out of England would paint the ship, the top of the ship, on a piece of glass, and we'd put the camera there, and it would look like that whole Titanic was sitting there on this freighter that we bought.
When we shot the footage of the Titanic, when we first discovered it underwater, Bob Stedman and I decided that we wanted to see very little of the ship. We wanted to use the lights from the actual submarines to show what we could see. It worked out perfectly. And the reason I say perfectly, when they discovered the actual Titanic, if you look at the footage of the films that they shot of the Titanic, it matches our footage exactly.
I thought that the effects were quite wonderful. There was also an artistic quality to them. They weren't perfect, but they worked for the story we were telling. And because you're underwater, 2.5 miles down, you're creating a vision that you can make what you think it should be. And as it turns out, because 5 years later we see what Ballard saw, it's pretty close. I will never forget when I first viewed that footage, I recognized right away that he had done some shots that Rico and Bob Stedman had designed in the movie. Coming up over the stern, where you see the name Titanic and then float over the back of it to be a reveal, that was Rico and Bob's work. They had figured that they wanted to do that, and it worked great. It was eerie to me because when I saw the real life footage, and I remember working on the film, there were a lot of similarities. I mean, it was a matter of art imitating life.
Strangely enough, when they discovered the real Titanic, apart from the fact that it was broken in two, what was interesting was the order in which they found things. They found a boiler and they found a funnel which led them on to the main wreck. That's pretty much what happened in the movie and in our model shooting, so there was a bit of a strange correlation to all of that.
If we were to do that film today, they would computerize a lot of the stuff in the film, which might have been helpful. However, all of the films that I've seen recently, they overdo it. They don't have a car crash, they have 6,000 cars crashing, or 400 airplanes hitting each other. And I think it's too much, and I think they overuse it. If used correctly, I think it enhances a movie, but used incorrectly, it destroys a movie.
The work that we did for, bearing in mind the period of time that we did it, which was the late 70s, was pretty good. It stood up quite well at the time. Looking back on it now, if you look at the film, yes, you can say some of the model stuff looks a little bit cheesy, but I think that's without the considerations of you don't have the CGI capabilities that are around today to help mask over the bad things.
In reflecting about shooting the models, would have done anything differently? I don't think so. I think I would have done everything exactly the same way we did it. I had enough time to do it properly, and I had the people to do it properly. And all I did was just direct them to what to do and where to go, and they did it.
When we were done with that job, Rico gathered us all together, and he said, look, I want to thank you for your hard work. I know how it's been. It's been dark and cold and rough. If I ever have a chance, I will hire you on a warm water picture. And we all laughed. It was a great idea and a great way to go out, because we knew he meant it. A year later, we get the call to go to the Bahamas to do Never Say Never Again with Sean Connery, that Rico's directing, and Bob is going to shoot, and I'm going with him. And how many times does that happen in a career? That's Rico Browning. That's who he is.